This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It's another in my series on creativity. Dave Edwards sits before you, and he's written a couple of books on the subject, and I'll be talking with him for the next hour or so. The subject is creativity. Dave Edwards has written a couple of books on the subject. As I usually like to do, though, I'd like to give him a couple of minutes to tell a bit about his background, what got him into studying the science or the ideas behind creativity. So, Dave, welcome. If you could give a little brief biography of yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I teach at Harvard University, and I have really, since I was very, very young, been really interested in creativity, honestly, mostly as a kind of expressive form. Ultimately, it became a real dialogue, obviously, initially with my very local family and community and so forth, but ultimately, my education led me to MIT, and I was initially in applied mathematics, and I wrote a couple textbooks in the kind of some frontier areas of applied math. And at the time became aware through various interactions of my work as fundamentally being an aesthetic journey, which was sort of surprising to me in certain ways, but ultimately enriched as I went on. I have been writing fiction for a very long time, mostly as my own sort of kind of personal activity, and one that I didn't really understand so much until my first company, which was related to an invention I made around a way to inhale insulin and eliminate injections, and I published that work in Science, and it became a company that sold in the late 90s, and after which I went to Harvard University, where I have been teaching since 2001. When I came to Harvard, really fascinated by the notion of interdisciplinarity, and to make a real long story short, this led me to open a cultural center in Paris called the Laboratoire, or the Lab, and my books on creativity relate to that, how that cultural center came about, and then how it works. And now I've moved that back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we have the Laboratoire here near MIT, and along with it an innovation restaurant called Cafe Art Science. And the last thing to say is that from all of this, I've started many companies and invented various things, and my latest company relates to digital scent and how we digitize scent and use that to not only add a new dimension to communications, but also deliver human health and wellness.
Well, I wanted to talk about the two books that I knew of, and maybe you could give a little background on them. The first one was Art, Science, Creativity in the Post-Google Generation, and the other one was The Lab, Creativity and Culture. If you could just give a little précis on either of those books, what caused you to write them, and what each of them are about, the similarities and differences between the two books and their approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I was at Harvard University in the early 2000s, and there was a massive conversation going on, led by then President Larry Summers, related to the fact that if Harvard really wanted to remain a frontier university 100 years from now, clearly it needed to find a way for the centers of excellence in philosophy and math and religion and government and so forth to collaborate around major problems. Fascinated by the fact that in these conversations at Harvard, amongst faculty looking to collaborate, we were missing many from the arts and humanities, and in general, it wasn't very representative. And so I began to explore, and this led to my first book, Art Science, amongst some of my faculty who, like me, had for many, many years been not really polarized by this art and science barrier, but actually in a way, their creative work had been catalyzed by it. And this led to a number of conversations with musicians and architects and scientists, and ultimately to a more international conversation that led to the book. And what I discovered in the book, and what led me to sort of coin this phrase art science, was that there is a group of us, maybe all of us to some degree, but a group of us really committed to ideas, and we pursue these new sort of creative ideas at the risk of our own lives in a certain way. And so we will take these ideas, and as they guide us often into another domain of application, we often run into institutional walls, and these people break those walls down and are kind of warned against it. And once they have done that, they are amazed by what they see on the other side of the wall, and they kind of make this career of breaking down walls. These are kind of disciplinary walls, or in a way, art and science walls. And I was fascinated by the fact that this universal sort of practice existed, and yet it wasn't really recognized in the institutions that needed this very activity to happen. And so I wrote this book, which was really a study of a number of creative lives and also my own life, and led to a conclusion that we need environments, what I call labs or culture labs, where we can create in this interdisciplinary way, that there's actually a process that we share in common. It's neither art as process, nor is it science as process, but it's actually a merger of the two. So art, in a real way, is both process of outcome, science is process of outcome, and as process, sort of institutionally, classically, we think of it as being image-driven, intuitive, comfortable with ambiguity, flourishing, and uncertainty, and sort of true in the sense that it's reflecting something fundamental about human experience. Whereas science sort of conventionally refers to the analytical and the deductive and the able to simplify a complex world into resolvable problems around testable hypotheses, and it's true in that it's repeatable. And so those two processes are taught in different departments and different institutions, but the creator in creating tends to do both. And so in the last thing I'll say is that in this creative process, we tend to do experiments where we test hypotheses. For example, I want to become the president of the United States, and I am 10. And so my hypothesis that I might become my class president or something, and I become that, and I'm sort of passionate about becoming that, but I'm waking up every night thinking I'm going to become president of the United States, and of course my friends are electing me, hopefully, president of my class. And so I have this passion that's driving me, and I become, say, president of my class, and then I think, gosh, I'm really far from ever becoming president of the United States. I become depressed. I don't really know what to do next. And creators, artists, scientists, chefs, whoever, tend to have these crises or these sort of ends of experiments where they suddenly are not sure where they're going, actually. And it may be a first draft of a novel, or it may be a first, try at an invention. And these moments of kind of white page moments, these classical moments that you remember in a creative process, are moments where you become intuitive and deductive. You become imaginative and able to simplify a complex world to something you can do. You sort of do both art and science. And so I was fascinated by, and I wrote in this book about the creation of centers or cultural labs where we actually did this kind of work, fundamentally creative work, and communicated sort of dialogue with the public through contemporary art forms. And I made that argument in my first book, Art Science, and it came out of that experience. Now, I then moved to Paris. I opened the lab, and it really began to flourish. And one of the things that I was interested to understand, and everybody was interested to understand, who was kind of seeing what went on, was, well, how do you really sustain this, actually? And so this kind of, and what comes of it? And so in the lab, I talk about how it's possible to create these cultural centers, which are very much like translational labs in Cambridge, where I'm speaking to you, Massachusetts, where we test hypotheses, we do experiments, we communicate not in peer-reviewed publications, but in exhibitions, not in science language, but in artistic language, and we create a cultural dialogue with the public as opposed to with our peers. And so it's much more like a kind of internet where our ideas are thrown out and we invite this public dialogue. And what's interesting about it is it's sustained by the the educational value of what we do, by the cultural value of what we do, and occasionally by the translational or maybe commercial or cultural value of what we produce. And the resources for those value propositions end up sustaining the lab, and it creates a space of dream in a very sort of matter-of-fact world. It creates a space of possibility in a world where we seem to have less and less. And it seemed to me at the time that I wrote the book that this was the kind of center we should have more frequently in our cities, in our schools, and even in our corporations.
Well, let me ask a specific question and then branch out more to the general. Ray, specifically what you do in the lab, do you have, say, painters, dancers, commingling with medical researchers and whatnot? Or, is it sort of a free flow of ideas that goes behind it, that where they mix? Or are the disciplines more sorted out and you just
no. Good question. Yeah, absolutely. So, in fact, fundamentally, what it does is it does very similar things, if you will, than what happens in a normal lab. So it's not a place, although this happens, where artists and scientists come and kind of talk and maybe do something. Actually, it's led by artists and designers or creators who are coming to the lab with a project. And so, in fact, I curate experiments. We've done now 23 or 24 since we opened, and we exhibit the results of these experiments every 6 months or so a couple a year in general. I look for very accomplished artists and designers, alternate between contemporary art and design. I'm typically rarely involved as an inventor in the design projects, and then the art projects I'm just simply curating, inviting these very interesting artists and designers to come to a frontier of science and dream. And once that dream is articulated, it could be a dream related to time, or it could be a dream related to water scarcity, or some other kind of frontier of the moment. And then I help bring in expert scientists, engineers, who then help navigate that frontier. But fundamentally, the Laboratoire is an art and design center where we're doing these experiments at frontiers of science. And just by virtue of being that frontier, dialogues happen. They're not that we're putting people in the room and say, figure it out. Passion is driving artists and designers to this frontier, whatever it is. And then we're bringing scientists in to help frame an experiment. And sometimes the role of the scientist or engineer is sort of anecdotal. Other times it's super fundamental. And these exhibitions lead to creative work. The creative work then moves on. And we've had, of those 22 or 24 experiments, we've had 4 or 5 projects go on and become museum collections in Europe and the United States, like at MoMA and other places. We've had multiple design technological designs move on to become commercial and are now companies in Asia and Europe and the United States, and related to things like edible packaging and breathable food and digital scent. And so it is a translational lab where we do these kinds of experiments, and the public then, if you any day come to the Laboratoire, you would be able to walk in for free, walk into an exhibition, which is probably unlike an exhibition you've seen before. It's really not like something you'd see in even in a MoMA kind of museum, but it's a real work in progress, but it is fundamentally an art or design exhibition. Now, alongside that, we do have so every couple of weeks we have a free public presentation by artists, designers, chefs, and perfumers, and various folks. And we have a number of collaborating institutions ranging from the Harvard Medical School that has the humanities program to the Wyss Institute of Biological Engineering that has a great interest in this merger of art and design, particularly around biology. We have cultural track. We have a track related to design, the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And so, in fact, the kind of activity I'm describing is happening increasingly in the creative world, and there's not really a forum for it. And we get typically full audience, 80 or 100 people for every one of these. And then there are other activities simply by virtue of the space existing where
Let me just ask you, back in the 1980s, the great American historian Daniel J. Boorstin had written a series of books in which he profiled thinkers and intellectuals. One was called The Discoverers, which was on science. The other was called The Creators, about artists. And he sort of hewed to the classical model that most of us think of when we think of science and art, i.e., that a scientist is someone who uses little moments of creativity and service to discovering things that are already extant in the physical material universe, whereas a creator is sort of 180 degrees the opposite in that they will use moments of discovery in order to create something new, ex nihilo, say.
yeah.
Do you hew to that Boostinian kind of model?
No,
And if not, let me just say, if not, then
yeah.
can you give me an example of where art and science have mixed profitably and how it did in one of your experiments or one of your lab?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I think that the caricatures, if you will, of what it is to do science and what it is to do art there's a lot of truth in them, and for sure, if you go into any typical, art studio or any sort of typical science lab, the kind of process that you're just describing is generally true. Um, Now, when you go to frontier science and frontier art, and look at how the pioneers of science and of art create, there's something fundamentally similar, and so those really simple lines there go away. So, in the 21st century world we live in, almost all simple lines go away. Actually, they definitely do here. So. There's quite a literature that I could point you to, and you may also be aware of, in this sort of co-art science creation. As you know, really the distinction between art and science was never made fundamentally until Newton, and especially post-Newton, and a lot of the advances in science leading up into and through the 19th century seem to give science as kind of as you just described it. We can put more detail into that, but really gave science kind of a seeming control over the future. Suddenly it seemed possible, which it really didn't seem hundreds of years ago. It suddenly seemed possible to sort of create the future, and by science, deductive science, whereas intuitive art, which again all melded together hundreds of years ago, really never could figure out how to have that kind of control. Now, we're in an era right now, and I'll come back to your question here, but we're in an era right now where we're sort of discovering that this sort of simplistic, pure science let's frame the world, let's simplify the world, and then make, with our scientific, mathematical, and physical understanding of the world, kind of design cars and planes and all kinds of things, drugs, to improve, or it seems to us to improve the world. We're sort of finding out today that many of those things that we've created are actually not very sustainable. That we have created really quickly, actually in a pretty short period of time, given the power that science in this sort of conventional way has given us, a very different world. And in many ways, it's been beneficial, and especially in the short term. But in the last decades, a number of signs from the environment to health to social and politics and so forth have indicated that, well, maybe we need to think in a more long-term way, and recognize that we're maybe not so confident about what the conditions of the future will be, that we can kind of design or create or sort of discover the future without actually living it. So now, let's leave that aside for a second. I just want to point out that because of that, you're finding now lots of crossover. So you'll find in some labs here, for example, the Broad Institute here, headed by Eric Lander, MIT, Harvard, they have a floor dedicated to an art studio. Or in George Church's lab, he's a really, really talented scientist at the Harvard Medical School. He has an artist just constantly in his lab, actually. And many other examples to give you, but in general, partly because we're all now beginning to, many are now, particularly those at the frontier, beginning to look much further out and in a more sort of humble way, recognizing that the 2 plus 2 is 4 sort of world that you sort of discover, and then technology translates into sort of useful things, is not as clearly representative of what the future will be as we used to think. So, pioneers. Let's take a typical pioneer, and I can give you lots of examples of ways that artists and scientists have collaborated at the lab and useful things that have come out of that. But let me just generally and sort of say that as a pioneer, I'm at a frontier. I may be an artist, I'm a scientist, but let's say I'm a scientist at the frontier, or just a pioneer in some literal sense. I wake up in the morning and I'm not really sure where is water. I may not know quite where north and south is, and I sort of do experiments. I walk in certain directions, and I kind of listen to certain things, and by a combination of observation, sort of intuition. It's not quite deductive, although there is deduction happening, but I'm kind of using all of my senses. If somebody shows up, they may be very different than me. They might not be from my culture and country, but if they sort of have a good idea, I tend to listen to it. And so I'm super curious and I'm super open, and I'm not really that arrogant because I really don't know. That's the real nature of a frontier. And whether you're Einstein, who, as you probably know, was a violinist and had lots of, if you read Einstein's writing, you'll see that he spoke of this continuity and continuum that is art and science. So because he lived at a frontier, so it was pretty obvious to him. Many of the Nobel Prize winners, if you look back, they had actually an artistic expression in their lives. Louis Pasteur, as you may or may not know, was a really talented artist. He early in his life thought to become a painter, and many people, frankly, until the end of his career, felt like he was not a scientist. He was way too intuitive, actually. So I think the distinction here is not to really turn over the caricature. It's just to say once you get to a frontier, those differences go away, and so what makes a laboratoire or a lab, a cultural lab, so relevant today is that we're all increasingly at frontiers, right? So we're all waking up in the morning, and we're not quite sure, what is our phone going to look like, what are our clothes going to look like, what is our politics, everything's changing so rapidly that everybody is increasingly at this sort of frontier, and so it makes it a kind of a renaissance moment where art and science are coming together. So last thing I'll say, just as an example, I had an idea to, so I'm a scientist, engineer, and I had an idea to create a cloud of food and in a special kind of a carafe using ultrasound. And I was really curious about what, this might mean to nutrition and to just the art of eating, actually. And it wasn't that I had a really explicit idea. I had no idea really about how practical this was. It wasn't really my idea. It was just sort of fascinated by this notion. And I began to work with kind of the leading culinary artist designer in France, and his name is Marc Bretillo. And he wasn't really sure what this meant either, but it was kind of a completely new form of food. You pour into this sort of vase any liquid that could be kind of liquefied cake, or it could be a coffee, or it could be a tomato soup or a martini, and then if you sort of turn it right, little ultrasound, like piezoelectric crystals, begin to vibrate, and they send ultrasound waves through the liquid, and it causes what we call cavitation, little droplets to fly off the surface. not change physically, but just move as a droplet into the air. And it's very small droplets hang in the air, and like a cloud, they fall out into a glass. And with a special straw that I invented, you can sip it out into your mouth. And so you have this, you sort of drink a cloud. And what was interesting to me about that was it was 50 micrograms of cloud, like a martini or coffee or soup. So like no calories, essentially no alcohol, and yet it was quite an amazing sensation. And so with Mark, we created this really beautiful form that became called the WAF, WHAF, and people came to the laboratoire to see it, and it was interesting. I don't think anybody knew what to do with it, but it was really interesting. Well, today, just to ramp forward, it's now a product that's used around the world. There's a company in Hong Kong that makes this. It's one of the recent baristas, the leading barista in the world, received the WAF as a present. It's used in the coffee industry to sample coffees without basically having any caffeine, and it's very, very powerful. It's an aromatic experience. There's a big interest in the FDA, where you have foods and drugs, and a lot of the problems related to obesity and drug abuse are related to the fact that we're really not looking to have more calories or to get medicated. We just want a great experience. So could you actually create a sensation that would satisfy these urges and actually improve health? So this object, which began in a very hypothetical idea, it was developed with an artist in a completely cultural context, nobody thinking it might be useful, ultimately became useful. And so the artist allowed me to express an idea in a completely aesthetic way. I helped the artist actually move into a form of expression that he would never have imagined. And so together we invented what ultimately became useful.
And that's an interesting story. Let me just ask you about the flip side of that, though, what I guess I would call the quality of creation, because art is filled certainly with a lot of gimmick art, art that's just basically the artist just taking selfies of themselves, going back even centuries. And then there's a lot of bad science, people like an Immanuel Velikovsky that come up with the wackiest of ideas that
Yep,
have
absolutely.
no kind of real application and no even real basis in science.
Yep.
At both your lab and also in other endeavors you may have encountered, do you think it's a good practice, or have you noticed that will you settle for 9 failures in the art and science for the one thing that may succeed?
Oh, yeah. Well,
And
so
is the generation of ideas more at a premium than the quality?
no, well, I think no, well, I think that firstly, I failure is a wonderful thing in many ways, but quality is the most important thing. So I think that you really are saying two different things. What's always true in frontiers, there's a lot of messy stuff going on. I think that people who are real pioneers and make a living at Pioneer don't do messy things. So they may fail in a certain way, but it's kind of a beautiful failure. So it's a very aesthetic failure. So I think that bad science and bad art is bad, right? So it's not a good idea to be doing either. Um, I think that frontier art and frontier science make all kinds of mistakes, but they ultimately discover. They ultimately lead to discovery, and the path from the frontier to the discovery is an aesthetic one. So it's right. It's quite beautiful, even though it may be very painful. And so that's I'm speaking very abstractly. But let me say that for sure, for all kinds of reasons, there's kind of a domain of sci art, if you will, where there's a lot of stuff going on. Some of it of real value, some of it of just sort of questionable art, questionable science, and again, if you look at just any really new kind of activity, and while this kind of activity does go back a very long time, the reality is we are kind of re-emerging from a very institutional and in a way successful era that is the 19th and 20th century, and moving to a much more integrated world right now. So this kind of activity is a little messy, and so there's a lot of bad art, bad science, as you say. Um, but I think it's important, and I'm by no means alone here, to articulate this work in the most high quality artistic and design way, and only with the valid scientific frontiers with true pioneers. So, all of that is a little bit qualitative, but ultimately, our work, by virtue of, for example, we have an exhibition going on right now. I don't know if you've heard about Rain Room, but it is an amazing exhibition that went from the Barbican in London to MoMA in New York to right now LACMA in Los Angeles. It's also in Shanghai, and it is a work of art that has attracted massive audiences. So over 1 million people have already gone to it, and you kind of stand in line and like forever in line to get into this thing. But it's some very talented artists in London. They call themselves Random International, and we did an experiment with them. And what did we do? We brought them here to Harvard. They began to work with my Harvard colleagues in medical robotics, very internationally renowned scientists, and they explored in their work, and we're exhibiting it right now, an exploration of the uncanny valley. So one of the things that fascinates us today, as we have more and more machines and really smart machines around us, is this notion that basically when human-looking machines or objects are before us, generally we have a feeling of empathy. It's like a cartoon. There's sort of an empathetic connection. But when these objects begin to look too much like us, we actually become uneasy. And then the more near to us they seem, the more uneasy we become. And this fascinates us partly because our world is increasingly surrounded by an artificial intelligent machine world, and we want to understand, well, how do we coexist happily, actually? And so it's a very ambiguous sort of space. And so these artists actually have focused on this and have done an exhibition and created a work that is really wild, and I could explain it to you, but just to say that it's kind of a robotic work, and it's actually been purchased by the Pace Gallery. It's going to open their new gallery in Menlo Park, and then it goes on to the Picasso Museum in Paris. And so it is being completely taken seriously in a science world here at Harvard, in a contemporary art world, the Pace Gallery, and then by very established museum, the Picasso Museum in Paris. So I think it doesn't mean that this particular work is going to endure and be a fundamental discovery that's going to change contemporary art or scientific understanding, but it's on that path, right? And it's a valid aesthetic work. So I think that's the key thing about this sort of art science process, that it's a true sort of universal process of pioneers at true frontiers. And there's a caricature of it that is not at a frontier, and that's really not what I'm talking about.
Since you brought up AI, let me go in a general direction in that sense by asking this. We've talked a bit about some of the end results here. I want to talk a bit about the process that you employ, both at the lab and elsewhere, that other people may do. The poet John Keats came up with a term called negative capability, which at its root basically says that someone who is creative can basically make deeper, more fundamental connections. It's making leaps of illogic that in hindsight you say, oh, of course, that makes sense. But before that person who comes along to make those connections does indeed make those connections, most people will not make any connection between those things. Do you account for the process of that sort of leap from the 1, 2, 3 to sort of the geometric progression, or from 1 to 3,722? Excuse me. And by doing so, have you found any patterns that either in art or science, how they may progress in certain ways like that?
Yes, absolutely. So I am writing a new book, and it has a running title. It'll probably be different when it comes out, but it's among other things, it's fundamentally this an exploration of this notion that I call creating to matter, and what I mean by that is not that everything doesn't matter in some way. A raindrop can matter a lot, but in creating, of course, is a very general notion. My kids create, and maybe in a sandbox, and that's totally a creative act. I'm interested in creating, and I'm going to get to the Keats comment, but I just want to say that I'm interested in creating um, a thing. It could be a book, it could be from a dance, it could be an invention, but creating something that matters to me, where I wouldn't have created it, but also something that matters to enough others that this created thing will endure without me. And so it has a life. It's a durable life. And so in the same way that you have a child, and the child goes off to have a happy and successful independent life, creators who are really passionate about their creation have this sort of hope and will for the created thing. They really project themselves into their created work, and that created work, they sort of watch the reaction of others, and they sort of evolve their work, whether it's a writer who's writing a book, an agent is helping her or him, and so on and so forth. There's kind of this editing that goes on as the creative work moves out into the world, and ultimately, and it's funny from a creator point of view, there's this moment where you suddenly realize, wow, it's not me anymore. It's like it's got this, it is me and it's not me. It's pretty fascinating. So in this process of creating to matter, I find there's 7 sort of dimensions to it, and one of them has to do with this sort of intuition that Keats is referring to, and it's really fundamental in creating something totally new, and that actually meets a need or serves a purpose. It's really fundamental that in moving out with your created work into whatever community or world, that you sort of don't lose yourself, right? And so yourself at the end of the day is an accumulation of experiences that are yours and make you sort of more your moment than any history of your moment ever will be. So you sort of have felt your moment in time in a really unique way, given where you were born, given all your interactions. So what you have to say is incomparable. Nobody can say it, and it's really belongs to the moment because it is the moment, right? So that you not losing sight of those experiences and holding on to those experiences and sort of trying to step away from all of the structures of logic and of career, like how to make money and all these kinds of things that sort of society gives you sort of direction for. Creators do a lot to sort of find themselves, and in that become the super intuitive kid that goes from being running down the block chasing a kid to throw sand in his face or something, to the PhD, in whatever. How did that happen, right? It wasn't sort of a logical, how do you go from throwing sand in somebody's face to getting a PhD? It's pretty intuitive, actually, although there's various logical steps there. And so that kind of kid-like survival, I need to exist, I matter in a certain way. That spirit is something that is fundamental to creating things that matter, and so I have thought a lot about that, and as I say, I'm writing this new book where I go into more detail.
Well, let me take the flip side of that, because oftentimes a lot of artists I know always have this idea about they're divinely inspired, divine inspiration. And I think that's a fallacy. Another thing that I often hear is people talk, you need childlike wonder. People should be more childlike and whatnot. But the thing that I have experienced with art, and great art, whether it's painting or writing or filmmakers, is that you need the critical facility to go back and edit. Whether it's editing a film, whether it's editing some writing, whether it's going back in and putting finishing touches on a painting. And this is something that in some certain sense is sneered at, because a lot of people, I think, look at creativity as primarily an emotional thing, a release, rather than the intellectual. So let me ask you this. What premium, if any, do you put on the after, once the initial thing has been spilled out there as the idea or the aim, that comes back for the critical refinement, and how important is that in the process?
It's huge. It's huge. I mean, when I talk about seven dimensions, I'm totally going from the passion, empathy, innocence to ultimately obsessive perfection. I mean, there's a lot of steps and dimensions to creating the matter, and so what you just described is totally right. And there's a couple ways to think about it. One, when I'm editing my book or sort of reshaping my sculpture, if you will, or even advancing my invention, a couple things are happening. One, I'm sensitive to the primacy of form. So in the creating to matter process, there is the outcome. Finally, there's this work in a museum or invention that's being used all over the world. But most of the time in the process, we're not there actually. We're in some sort of an intermediate zone, and we're needing feedback actually, and readers or various agents or the public in general. We're getting feedback, and we and also just the next day we get our own feedback, and that feedback is being mediated by the forms that we create. So if I write my first draft of my book and it's so terribly written that nobody really will read it, if I really care about what I'm trying to say, I really try and learn the form that actually articulates the idea I'm trying to express, and it then creates dialogue with an agent, an editor, and so form. And it's, by the way, same is true for scientists, right? So I may end up discovering. So Stefan Hell is a German scientist who won the Nobel Prize a couple years ago in chemistry, and he for a certain kind of fluorescence microscopy of high resolution, and it took him all his life to make that ultimate discovery that got him the Nobel Prize. Meanwhile, he wrote article after article after article in lots of different contexts. If had those articles not been written in a form that actually communicated the ideas to a very sophisticated audience, even though he may have had a good idea, it never would have mattered because he needed lots of feedback, and there was this sort of conversation going on with the public. That's the true life of a creator, particularly a creator who's creating something that will exist when he or she is no longer alive. And so this editing process, absolutely. So there's two things going on there. It's me being very sensitive to form, the aesthetic form of my work, but then ultimately it's also understanding that for my form to matter, my idea to matter, it needs to change. So in the same way that the child does not dress in the same way, if you will, does not sort of behave in the same way when he's 7 as when he's like 27, sort of adapts a certain and in many other kind of less sort of literal ways adapts, and the idea of who that young man or woman is evolves, and he or she never ceases to be he or she. They change as the world changes by them coming into the world. So this process of editing and refinement is completely at odds with the sort of Beethoven nature of creation as somebody who just kind of closes it. He can be deaf and he makes this amazing sort of symphony. It really doesn't happen that way in general.
Yeah, let me ask this. People, I think, when they look at things that are rather obvious, if you look at great athletes, for example, most people know they couldn't be a LeBron James or a Tom Brady or one of these great athletes because it's so obvious that I can't shoot as well as LeBron, I can't throw a ball the way Brady can. But people often think that, well, I can pick up a pen, I can type at a typewriter, I can get some canvases and paint. On a personal both you personally and maybe from what you've observed, do you think that there is the natal ability that someone has, and that no matter, for example, I don't believe that I could take singing lessons from now until doomsday, and I'm not going to be ever offered a job with any opera company. So, do you think that there are inherent limits to a person's creativity, whether they're someone who has very little or they are Beethoven?
Well, yeah. So I think that I think there's two things here. One is your ability to be creative or to participate in the creative process. because again, it's much more, as we're saying, than knowing how to create the castle in the sandbox. But being able to, how universal is that actually? And then there's the question about, which is a more specific one, and it relates to kind of the LeBron James sort of example. That's with basketball and a certain sort of physical, kind of requiring kind of a genetic sort of, and also some environmental, um, pieces of fortune. I think that writers or singers or any particular kind of artist generally does have a sort of a environmental genetic kind of framing that can make he or she a more articulate singer. Or now, of course, we've had many, many, many famous singers who don't sing well. We've had very many artists who don't draw well, and so we can't make too broad a sweep there. But in general, that's true. Now, having said that, what's key, and that's why I think just from an educational point of view, we need to be thinking so differently about how we educate young people. The key is to find your voice, right? It's to find your expressive form, and it may be light bulbs, it may be sand that you throw on the floor. I mean, the way to express a new idea or who you are in a way that brings value to others is pretty endless, actually. So, fortunately, we've left the era where the impressionists would get pushed out of the primary exhibition sort of milieu in France because they were in Paris because they were breaking rules, right? So fortunately, we're in a world where you have to break all the rules. So I think you're right again that so I would never have been able to sing opera or even sing, frankly, but I found my voice in another way. So, and that search for your voice is a very precious thing. It's a real search for personal identity, actually, in a way, and I think that's open to all of us. I do think that we have, different sensitivities and abilities to, exist for long at a frontier, and it has to do with how you grew up and all kinds of factors, as I was alluding to earlier. But I think participate in the creative process and find your voice. I think that's a pretty universal opportunity.
Well, let's end this segment here, and in a final segment, I'll talk just a couple more things and give you a little bit time to just wrap up any final thoughts on creativity and what you have in the future with yourself and the lab. And we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with David Edwards about creativity. David, before I give you just a couple of minutes to wrap up, let me just ask you in general, rather than your specific, where do you think that the study of creativity is going? And do you think something like, say, AI, artificial intelligence, is one of these things where in learning how to create intelligence in something outside the human, we'll get a greater understanding of what intelligence and creativity is within the human?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think uh, the so there are two ways of thinking about creativity. Probably in many ways, actually, but let me just make it sort of simplify it into two ways. One has to do with kind of the mechanics, I'll say, of going, from some new idea to a realized thing, a created thing that serves a purpose. And so, as you probably know, there's work going on at Google to kind of create with artificial intelligence some pretty beautiful, they look like sort of Van Gogh and other kinds of paintings, just kind of come out of the blue in a certain way. And so I think that we will advance absolutely from an artificial intelligence point of view into a world where we can, through machines, kind of create what hasn't existed before. Now, what I am fascinated by when it comes to the creativity that I explore, and I believe that this will be will increasingly matter really just to humanity here in the coming decades. largely because of the success of the innovation and the challenges that the innovation of the last century or two have created to human life on the planet. So that process is related to this personal journey, whereby you or I am searching for our place in the world in some general way. Create things. We may create a little white lie with our dad or mom or a kid, and it leads to a dialogue, and that doesn't lead very far, and we kind of move on, and I improve our language, and we kind of learn to create in various ways personas and things like that. That kind of it's an experimental dialogue with the world around us. We become sensitive to the world around us because actually we need the world around us, like a plant growing up. We need the world to kind of nourish us, and we sort of return value. And so our creative life is very associated with our personal life. Now that makes us really quite sensitive in ways that defy, in the Keats sense, defy our really understanding. Actually, we're living every second and sort of absorbing lots and lots of information and translating it through the prism of our own, in a way, a wish to survive, and it's leading us to then create. Now, we may end up creating the same painting that some Google AI program creates, but the painting, if we have lived this kind of aesthetic life, will be so much more, it's more authentic, it's more connected to what is happening right now, and some kind of a true sort of untold story that is happening in some way. It's the more significant the painting, the more universal that experience is. So the expressive power of AI in this intuitive way it's not obvious to me how or when this becomes digitized in a certain way. It's not obvious to me that that's really what's happening with AI or even possible with AI. And I'm really not an expert in AI, but I think that from a human perspective, the creating to matter in the way, by the way, for thousands of years, this is how humans created, right? Why did the first artist draw on cave walls, 20,000 years ago? It wasn't for ego, I'm pretty sure. It wasn't for, art for art's sake. There was something fundamental about their own experience that was confirmed, led to a kind of conversation, a dialogue, and in a way their experience mattered more by putting this art on the wall. And that, whether it is in the Parthenon or the first wheel or in, a number of creations, of course, from the ancient civilization, tended to be really expressive of a true need experience in a way that now having AI that can just make things it's not obviously as expressive or be as sustainable, right? I think that the if you probably have traveled into villages in medieval villages in Europe, and it's really amazing how they're still there actually, and they have but they grew organically and they were created in a real public dialogue over a very long period of time. And so unlike our cities today that are much more top down, and it's like some sort of AI created these buildings and kind of top and created a city in 10 years and suddenly we're all there, but it's probably not going to be around in another 1,000 years. So I think that in a world that survives, and of course we are at a point right now where you could argue maybe human existence doesn't really survive as we kind of understand it today. But if it does, and I hope it does, I think it will be through this kind of long-term human-led aesthetic creation, and that's something I'm hoping for.
Well, in closing, what is in the future, in the near future, the next few years for both you and Le Lab?
Well, I am right now, and this emerged out of the lab, working on, and with lots of others, on the digitization of scent and it's been pretty public for the last few years, but it's now become it's translating into a real commercial product called Cyrano. But what fascinates me is this notion that we have two kinds of forms of communication in digital communications. One is visual and one is auditory. We have five senses. Three are communicated through the air. One of them is not digitized, it's scent. Science has sort of discovered over the last 10, 12 years since the Nobel Prize and the discovery of how olfaction works, come to realize that scent and our perception of scent is fundamentally connected to our well-being and our health. And so there's become quite a move in medicine and technology to digitize scent to help empower human wellness and ultimately healthcare outside of a hospital environment. So we came up with this idea, myself and a student of mine, and developed it with some perfumers in a first exhibition in Laboratoire, and then it's evolved through museum exhibitions in New York and elsewhere, and ultimately has become a really practical product that initially is something I carry with me on my car, and it's a digital scent speaker, and it plays with a kind of an iTunes of scent, and it plays scent melodies, if you will. Over time, your nose loses track of scent after about 8 minutes because of olfactory fatigue, and so it avoids that by evolving in time, like a meal or a walk through a garden. And it helps wake you up, slow you down, help you escape, remember your grandmother, whatever. And so wellness is a big problem in driving, basically, and so it really meets a need, and there's a lot of interest in it. So it's funny how it's kind of gone from, again, a very ethereal sort of idea to this broader notion that will be developing in the coming years outside of the level as well, but it's really quite fascinating. Last thing to say is that we have in opening here, we opened a restaurant, and a lot of our work ends up being very sensorial, and so I'm fascinated in growing this kind of an intermediate space, like a restaurant, and where ideas like I'm describing can actually exist and be part of a public dialogue without having to go out and sell in CVS or be part of a much more mass dialogue until they're ready. And I believe that restaurants, bars, kind of sensorial environments are really adapted in this era to be kind of internets in a way, kind of physical internets, and mediating this creating of tomorrow.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned scent, because scent is of all the senses, the five main senses, most associated with memory, and memory is one of the bedrocks of art, I believe, that people want to recall things. So that's an interesting connection. Anyone who's found this conversation interesting, I will have a link below this video, today's web page. You can contact him directly that way. And I just want to thank you for spending some time and talking about your work and the ideas regarding creativity.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much.